More than 5,000 years ago, as man began organizing into large cities due to the growth of early societies, they decided to establish the first city-state which served as permanent refuges and in turn facilitated the establishment of trade routes with other cities. Thanks to these cities, the communities were able to set common goals, establish laws, manage resources and property through a centralized government, a structure with priests and rulers at the top and peasants and workers below. Elected by a group of priests, the society was governed by a king, who was responsible for controlling its territory and overseeing all aspects of society, like tax collection, approving new laws, resource management, and diplomacy with neighboring cities, were the activities carried out by those primitive officials. At least for the lower echelon of society, the law was the same for all. The principle of an eye for an eye was enforced, punishment varied depending on the judge's discretion, and penalties were sometimes lenient for minor offenses, but severe for more serious ones. For much of our history, we were subject to the rule of a few, an age of monarchies when societies were largely hierarchical and political power was completely centralized in self-proclaimed kings, who claimed to rule by divine right. Citizens outside the political class were subject to the laws imposed by these rulers, and anyone who questioned the king was ignored or, in the worst cases, silenced, imprisoned, or publicly executed. As technology advanced, social well-being improved alongside. Empires rose and fell, driven by the pursuit of wealth, territory, and new lands to conquer. With population growth, nations faced the challenge of maintaining their vast empires while ensuring the well-being of their inhabitants, political stability and harmonious relation between the states and its citizens, the key to a lasting empire. We mastered fire and sailed the seas in search of new trade routes, and by accident we arrived in a new world, where colonies were founded and visa royalties established as the crown's highest authority, though thousands of miles away. Eventually, three kingdoms ruled these lands with an iron fist over the native inhabitants, united by the common goal of any nation, to conquer, govern, and expand. For the next few centuries, everything seemed to be going well, at least for the few hierarchs whose empires continued to grow in wealth and territory. Then in the north, among the upper echelons of society, a desire began to emerge. Independence from a kingdom that replaced its people with humiliation, fear, and constant domination. It was then that the first of many revolutions on the continent took place. In 1776, the United States of America declared independence from the English crown, an act that will spark many others to follow. Just as Prometheus delivered fire to humanity, freedom whispered to those brave enough to defend it. The French Revolution in 1789 and the Spanish-American Wars of Independence were the culmination of centuries of oppression and the beginning of autonomous, representative, and democratic governments. The 20th century was defined by a profound ideological struggle that brought about major events such as the Second World War and the Bolshevik Revolution, one fueled by the supremacist ideology of a tyrant and the other inspired by the utopian ideals of a philosopher. This century was also marked by the ongoing fight for freedom, justice, and equality by those still striving for the rights. By then, racial stigma against black people have been largely dismantled. Women have secured the right to vote, and particularly in the West, individuals enjoyed greater autonomy, representative governments, and the freedom to advance within social classes. The Industrial Revolution exponentially increased job opportunities and prosperity in the countries that experienced it. Individual freedom was achieved and laws are no longer dictated by a select group of monarchs, but by representatives of the majority. Yet, 5,000 years after the first state societies were founded, despite all this progress in social welfare, we still haven't eradicated the greatest problem in society: social inequality. Today, inequality is often measured by an individual's economic status. The higher the income, the higher their position on the social pyramid. International organizations estimate there are around 1 billion of people living in acute poverty, and all of these in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $65 a month. But how can this be in a world where we all have the comforts and tools to build the perfect society? Why does so much inequality persist? And what we can do about it? Easy, we simply need to redistribute wealth to those most in need, create public jobs and institutions that support vulnerable populations, implement programs to help developing nations, and fund these efforts through taxes on the wealthiest. Additionally, laws must regulate the prices of essential goods and services to ensure access for all. The ultimate goal is to build a society where everyone has opportunities and no one is left behind. Many view repealing society's responsibility to the state as a feasible solution, believing that the state will then focus on passing laws that support the most urgent social causes, when all it achieves is expanding its influence over people's life and financial freedom. However, the real consequences of such policies on a country's social stability are frequently overlooked, and in most cases prove detrimental to its development. We entrust power to the state and expect it to reciprocate, believing that the taxes we pay each year will be used to support the causes we value, causes the state claims to champion. Governments propose the creation of public institutions dedicated to social justice, equity, and the well-being of the most disadvantaged, forgetting that these same institutions are then filled with acts of corruption and nepotism. As with any system where the state holds excessive control over its citizens, the ultimate power and direction depend entirely on the integrity of a good servant leading the administration. But look for the people if a social servant chooses to exploit the system for personal gain. We briefly talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, which later led to the formation of the Soviet Union, an example of how the flawed implementation of socialist ideas can have disastrous consequences. The Soviet Union with its socialist system aimed to realize Marx's vision of an egalitarian society without social classes, where wealth was shared equally, labor exploitation was eliminated, poverty eradicated, and children could grow up having a world promising a prosperous future. But the reality was starkly different. The Soviet Union struggled internally to lift its population out of poverty and famine. The agricultural sector was particularly affected by high state taxes. For 1928, the Soviet authorities requisitioned nearly 3 million tons of grain. This same policy allowed to the state take any extra crop produced. A strict price controls and mandatory production quotas ultimately led to a drastic drop in production, followed for the exodus of peasants to urban centers in search of the wealth that they couldn't obtain as farmers, a product of the policies that make the sector no longer viable. Some might argue that the Soviet Union was an exceptional case where these socialist policies and laws were implemented abruptly without time to take root in society, leading to the crisis that ultimately contributed to its collapse. However, the reality is more complex. Even similar socialist policies were applied today to support the population, significant societal progress is unlikely. Much of Europe will illustrate this point. Countries that grew up wealthy through policies they now argue harm the most disadvantaged. After reaching the peak of development, they began redistributing wealth, with results such as migration crisis, energy shortages, rising unemployment, declining foreign investment, political corruption, and in some cases, the gradual erosion of democracy. We want to support the poor by demanding action from others, taking away their freedom and devaluing their labor, while granting more power to the state. This unintentionally creates a privileged political class driven by self-interest, which ultimately harms everyone beneath their power and status. Ironically, after thousands of years, we seem poised to return to monarchies and absolutism, as if delegating our social responsibility to a select few could solve the world's problems. Institutions like the United Nations claim to champion freedom, yet their actions matter little more than filling the headlines of international papers with populist and sensationalist speeches. These are the same institutions to which millions of our taxes are allocated, only for some influencers to come in and show them how their job are done. If we are truly committed to eradicating inequality, we must start by supporting the right policies. Policies that don't focus on regulating the prices of basic goods or approving endless aid packages that don't address critical needs like job creation or a good healthcare system. It's that only leaves these people dependent solely on the guarantee of a welfare state. We shall also avoid demanding higher taxes from the rich or imposing broad taxes increases, as such measures often harm the market, drive up prices, and ultimately hurt the consumers, rather than helping the most vulnerable. Inequality can be eradicated if we have the will to act. While the task requires a great effort, but with the right philosophy, it is a challenge we can overcome. always learning from the past mistakes and evolving as a society. Above all, we must never yield to those who seek to exploit the system with false promises and unfounded ideals. We must understand how such individuals operate to remove them from the power and prevent a future filled with injustice.